Well, I'm so pleased that the Society's invited me and given me the privilege of giving the inaugural Feminist Law Lecture. We're also celebrating International Women's Day, and it's especially special because we're celebrating 100 years of women in law. I don't have a very loud voice, so if people can't hear me, can you move down a little bit?
I can hear you.
Great, okay. So I'm a partner and I'm a head of international family law at Ben Hur Bell, which is a large human rights practice, and we've got offices throughout the northeast of England. The work I specialise in is working with all forms of domestic abuse, but with a particular speciality in working with black and minority ethnic women and children who've experienced abuse. So issues like FGM, forced marriage, trafficking, transnational abandonment, honour-based violence, you name it, all the light stuff. It tends to be what I do. And I'm going to use this time to talk to you about how amazing and powerful women lawyers and activists are when they work together, and how we can use law for systemic change for the better. I'm going to be speaking about my passion for human rights and women's rights and where that comes from. I'm going to be referencing some of my legal heroes and activist heroes and their amazing work. I'll talk about campaigns won and lost and campaigns ongoing, and how we've used the law strategically to improve the rights of women, and what my hopes are for you as the next generation, because we'll be handing over, I'll certainly be handing over to you fairly soon, and what I would hope that you would do and to carry on this work into the future. You are our hopes for the future, and there's absolutely no doubt about that. You're the future of the women in law, because protest and activism and law equals change. So that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about. Excuse me. So this is one of my heroes, Rose Hilburn. She was one of the first pioneering women to become, first of all, a lawyer, second of all, a barrister, third of all, a High Court judge. And she is really from a time where it was impossible for women to practice as lawyers. She's one of the first pioneers who broke that ceiling to get women actually to be allowed to practice law. I was reading about her today. She had a rapid rise because the first 6 years she was at the bar coincided with the war years of World War II, so there was no male barristers around, so she had a really rapid ascent up the career path. In 1975, she was appointed as the chair in an inquiry into what's going wrong in rape cases for victims of rape. 1975. And as a result of that, the law was changed so that women could not be cross-examined about their previous sexual history. Well, speaking as somebody who's a sexual violence complainants advocate on a pilot scheme at the moment, I can tell you that women are still being questioned, cross-examined about their previous sexual history in rape trials. And you're probably all very aware that in spite of Rose Hilburn's work, there's still an awful long way to go in terms of making the courts safe for women, criminal courts and family courts. So I'll start talking a little bit about my background, because being a lawyer seemed absolutely unachievable to me when I was growing up. I was born in a coal mining village. My father and all the men in the family were down the mines. In fact, my grandmother was a pit head worker, as it's called in those days. She worked on the slag heap trying to find bits of coal big enough to be able to then use and sell. So that it was a whole family business, really. Most of the women in my family were in service, which is not the civil service sort. It's more the downstairs of Downton. So from my perspective, the idea of being a lawyer just seemed completely unachievable. But I was from a really political family, and my grandparents and parents had gone through World War II and the atrocities which had led to the creation of the Human Rights Act, the Human Rights, and basically the United Nations. And the covenants that we all made to each other about how we wanted to be treated going forward after the atrocities and what had been done to Jewish community, gays, gypsies, disabled people and political dissidents in Nazi Germany. So that was the genesis of the UN and the European Convention, the United Nations Convention on Human Rights, which is the basis of our modern rule of law and our human rights law. And I start there because these rights are under attack more than they have ever been in any time in my 30 years practice as a lawyer. We're seeing the rise of the far right the way across Europe and America. We're also seeing world leaders such as Trump, Johnson, attacking and rolling back human rights law. We're seeing we've got a government now who would like to repeal the Human Rights Act. So it's really important that we're all aware of why we need them and why we need to fight for them. So I've grown up with politics and protest. My granddad was beaten and arrested and eventually banned from all the 5 coalfields for union organising because he was trying to change working conditions for the men underground so that it didn't become a life-threatening experience every time they went underground to work. My granddad's mantra was, if it's not right, we fight, and I've kind of grown up with that. My father was really active in the National Union of Mine Workers all his life, and he drummed into me that if you had an education, you could do anything at all. And it was his drive that caused me to become a lawyer. I have to say I was really resistant to it because I had my own hopes and dreams about what I wanted to do for the future, and being a lawyer was just not one of them. In fact, I wanted to be a spy. My dad was like, "Don't be silly, lassie, we've never had a spy in the family and we're not going to have one now." And I was like, yeah, we've had loads of lawyers, haven't we? So around about the time I was doing my A-levels was a really, really political time, really political. It was the Thatcher era. I remember in 1979 being woken up by my brother who said, "Come on, get out of bed, you can't pretend that the Tories haven't won the election." And just for a few minutes there I was really excited because we had a woman Prime Minister, and I'd never thought that was achievable. Not that she was ever a feminist and not that she did any favours for any women's or human rights. In fact, quite the opposite. But there was so much going on that was political, involving women, that it was impossible not to get caught up in it at that time. It was really, really fiercely political. And that was probably the last time when I can remember human rights and women's rights being attacked in the systematic way that they're being attacked now. Hi.
Hi.
Come in and join us.
Thank you.
So, when I was at doing my A-levels, somebody, I can't even remember who it was now, gave me a copy of Spare Rib magazine. And I remember sitting at home reading it from cover to cover, and it literally blew my mind. I could not believe that I was reading a magazine that was all about feminism and about what was going wrong for women and what needed to be done to change things for women. And a lot of it was about, and a lot of the content in Spare Rib, and I'd read it for years, in fact, until it stopped being in existence, about why and how the law needed to change to make it work for women. It's around about the same time that Erin Pitsey started the refuge movement for victims of domestic abuse. And this book came out and literally caused an absolute furore. I mean, if you weren't around, you wouldn't be able to... Do you remember it, Harriet? Yeah, me too. And so that really revolutionised how we looked at domestic abuse. It was a really brave, stark piece of work. Same time again, Helena Kennedy. Does everyone know who Helena Kennedy is? Yeah, Baroness Kennedy. She brought out Eve Was Framed. She's just actually this last year brought out Eve Was Shamed, which is about 1 million years later, sequel to the first one. And in fact, I was talking to her about it at the weekend. She was telling me that you know, you like to think when you produce something like that and you're full of vim and you think you're going to change the world, that it's really going to happen. And then, you know, all these years later, she's written a very, very similar book about how things are still not going right for women in the law. But she's not lost her appetite to change it. So yeah, the Thatcher years. Thatcher was, in fact, have any of you seen Spitting Image? Yeah. The rest of you won't, but it's coming back again this year, which I think is no bad thing. The early 80s were a time of intense political activity, as I've already said. And it feels like the early 80s now. I've never had a time through history when I felt as much commitment and as much passion coming from everywhere, actually. The Grunwick dispute was one of the first times I recognised the power of the unions to work for women. This woman here is Jane Barr Desai, who brought out the Grunwick workers, the women who were working in film processing plants in appalling conditions and getting terrible, terrible pay. Round about the same time as the miners' strike, and also the miners came out in support of the Grunwick women. So it was a time of women really standing up and really saying, no, we've had enough, we're not doing this now, we're not playing your game. And I was such an impressionable young person at the time that it just kind of overwhelmed me and really shaped the way I was going to go forward and what I was going to be doing with the rest of my life. Similarly, at the same time as the miners' strike, and again, this was women being public and protesting in a way that I'd never seen before and no one from my generation had ever seen before. So it really did feel like what was happening for women at this time was really, really significant. And Helen, my oldest friend from university, is here. I think we really thought we were going to change the world, but it looks like we forgot. '79 was also the time of the Iranian Revolution, and that top left picture is the thousands and thousands of women who went out onto the streets of Tehran to protest against Sharia law, which had been imposed by the return of the Ayatollah Khomeini to Iran, and the fact that they were now told that they couldn't go out on the streets unless they were fully covered. And this was the response. I mean, it was just happening all over the world. It was a really, really exciting time. So it was slowly dawning on me that law might be quite a good idea after all, and that maybe we could use it in terms of social change. So I agreed I'd give it a fair chance, and I decided I'd go to Essex University to study law, because it was very, very left-wing, and I thought that might be somewhere where I might fit in. I didn't realise that this was the first year of the law school at Essex, and that the university had decided to open a law course at Essex to try and bring in a more right-wing class of student. So, oh God, I can't tell you how awful it was. It was just, I was just a square peg in a round hole. I did not fit in at all. I hated it. I hated every minute of it. I felt totally out of my depths. It was full of people who'd been to public school. It was very, very posh. And I left university with a law degree, still planning to be a spy, but with no immediate plans for how I might do it. And started getting involved in an awful lot of human rights projects, women's rights projects. Was involved with the Miners' Strike Fund and so on. And still waiting for the revolution to start. I want to mention at that time as well, it was a really critical time in terms of world politics and nuclear armament. And constantly we were being told that we had to prepare for imminent nuclear war. And one of the really important things that happened at that time was the Greenham Common Peace Camp. How many of you heard about it? No. The reason I'm mentioning it is because it's such an important part. It devastates me that it was such a huge thing and it was such a massive movement, and it's part of our feminist history, and that hardly anybody knows about it now. What had happened was that the government had given the United States Army power to store nuclear weapons and set up a military base at Greenham Common. It was the era of the Falklands War. There was tensions rising between Russia, the United States, and the start of the really special relationship, so-called, between the UK and the United States, and the ever-present nuclear threat. So women from all over the UK came and set up camp at Greenham, hundreds and hundreds of women, and it was a massive, massive peace camp. And there was several really, really spectacularly big actions that happened when we were there. I first went when I was at university with Helen. We'd go down and camp when there was a big action, and there'd be a call would go out. I mean, no social media in those days. You know, there would be a telephone tree where somebody had phoned somebody at such and such student union and say, we need everyone to get down to Greenham this weekend because there's a big action on. And it was usually when they were bringing in more missiles or they were bringing in more troops. And what we'd do is just lie in the road and just not let them bring the buses through. And generally make a nuisance of ourselves. One of the biggest events that we went to, I think, was when we actually cut down the perimeter fence. Oh, that's Helen on the right, me in the middle, that's us at Greenham. And this is the action when the fence got taken down. And we were put in cells. It was all terribly exciting and a bit slightly military, which was a bit of a contradiction, but we all went with it. We were put in cells of 4 people. And there was somebody who was shoulders, that was Helen. There was somebody who was cutter, they had the bolt cutters. So cutter had to get on shoulders. There was a photographer, and then there was me, who was the first time I was ever a legal observer in any action. And we're all hiding in the undergrowth. I mean, it was just ridiculous when you think about it. And at that point we realised, because we all had to dash the fence at 2:00 and all start cutting the fence down. We couldn't see any of the other cells, we couldn't hear anybody. And at that point we realised that none of us was wearing a watch. And then we started to whisper to each other, God, what if it started and we've missed it? it must be time. So we'd been there for ages. So eventually we decided we were going to go and hit the fence. And we actually ran to the fence 5 minutes before everybody else. So we're there very, very conspicuous. Tessa's on Helen's shoulders with the bolt cutters, photographer's snapping away, I'm standing around like a spare part, hoping I'm not going to get arrested. And then suddenly this police officer ran from nowhere and rugby tackled Helen and Tessa to the ground. And he grabbed hold of Tessa. Helen pushed him out the way and she shouted to Tessa, run, run, run. Tessa took off like a hare. He takes off after us. And then me and Helen are kind of running behind, Helen much more enthusiastically than me, because we had to shout at the same time, arrest me too, I'm just as guilty. And I'm thinking, God, I'm a law student, I'm never going to be a lawyer at this rate. And then just as all that was going on, all hell broke loose, and that happened, and everybody ran at the fence, and the fence actually got completely taken down. It was just amazing. Lots of women got arrested and they were later charged and got criminal convictions, Tessa being one of them. But they were all later overturned because somebody had the great idea that we could use the law on peaceful protest. I'm sure there was other things that they could have got done for at that time, but all of the Greenham Common convictions were eventually overturned and quashed. So it really started dawning on me at this time that there might be something in this law business and I might be able to do something in terms of affecting some systemic change. After university I went to Newcastle and I got a job working for the Legal Action Group doing research into the effectiveness of domestic violence injunctions, which is where really I got really steeped in what was happening for women in the privacy of homes and the danger and the real impact that was having on women's lives. It was a short report in the end because it was about how effective are domestic violence injunctions, and the short answer was they're not. And amazingly, all these years on, we're still struggling with the same presenting issues and the same difficulties in actually having an effective response, legal response to domestic abuse. At that time when I was doing the research, I met a group of amazing, strong, feisty black and minority ethnic women in Newcastle who didn't know it at the time, but they were going to change my life, the course of my life, my working life forever. They told me about their struggle, not only with abuse, but also with racism and a lack of effective response for women within their communities. I learned so much from them, and I really have to say that I still work with that same group of women now, and I couldn't do the job that I do without it. They're just incredible. So at that time as well, we're in the thick of the miners' strike, and Thatcher was determined to crush the miners because they were the most powerful union and the biggest threat to her and her government's intention of bringing in what their vision of I guess, a capitalist society would be. There came what became known as the Battle of Orgreave, and that's a picture from the Battle of Orgreave. And it was when there was literally hundreds of miners striking and demonstrating peacefully, and they were baton charged by hundreds of police on horseback. And this is actually a female photojournalist who's just about to get smacked around the head by that police officer for trying to do her job. Hundreds of miners were injured, hundreds were arrested, and they all ended up in the Orgreave trials, which was trumped up charges actually. It was a really nasty, brutal time. And then that brings me around to talking about one of my other legal heroes. This is Vera Baird. I don't know if people know Vera. Do you know who Vera is? Vera Baird? She's just had the most amazing career. This is her getting a doctoral degree from, I think it was the University of Newcastle actually, in civil laws. But she's actually a QC. She was the Justice Minister in the Labour government, and she's now the Victims Commissioner for the National Victims Commissioner. But when she was at the bar, and I used to instruct her at the bar, she defended the miners at Orgreave. And there was an amazing story. Mike Mansfield was leading, and I think she was a junior at the time. And the police line about why they had to act in the way that they did so brutally was that they were terrified, they were so intimidated. And there's a great story about Vera. She'd managed to get hold of a whole riot gear set, so the shield, the headgear, the shoulder pads. And she said, "So what were you wearing?" And the police officer, "Well, my uniform." And she said, "Well, were you not wearing this riot gear?" "Look, I've got some here. Well, why don't you put it on?" And the police were saying, I'm not doing that. I'm not putting it on." So Vera said, "Well, I'll put it on." So within a couple of minutes, Vera's in full riot gear with a baton. And she said, "Why were you intimidated?" I mean, just phenomenal use of advocacy. And I have to say, every single miner was acquitted. Nobody was convicted. It was an amazing legal victory. Truth to power, absolutely. So all of these, I'm still doing my legal research at the time. All of these different influences made me realise I was going to be a lawyer after all. And I ended up going back. I'd done my law degree, but I hadn't done, I think it's called the LPC now. When I did it, it was called Law Society Finals. It's a hideous exam. First day we went in to do the course, the lecturer came in and said to us, and she was the head of the law department then, she said, "Turn and look at the person on your left and then turn and look at the person on your right." And so we all dutifully did that, and she said, "One of you will pass." And it was so hard. It was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. But thankfully I got through it first time, because I wouldn't have been able to afford to reset, I don't think. And then a training contract, and I went to a left-wing firm in Newcastle, and they really encouraged me to do the work that I wanted to do around domestic abuse and women's rights, which was great. But God, I was scared. And I can remember the first time I was in court, this is the wonderful Maya Angelou talking about imposter syndrome. I felt like such an imposter. And I'm there in this suit that I've only just got, and it doesn't quite fit properly, and it's a bit big, and there's all these really seasoned advocates sitting around me in court, and I can't get my case on because nobody knows who I am. And I'm just sitting there thinking, oh God, I feel sick. And I was so convinced, and I can remember it to this day, just that feeling of thinking, any minute now somebody's going to come and put a hand on my shoulder and say, "Come quietly, love, we've reason to believe you're impersonating a professional woman." And that didn't leave me for a very long time, I have to say. And I don't think that's just something to do with being a working class woman. I think that's just something to do with how we as women respond to a situation like that. So if it happens to you, completely normal, you'll get over it. Promise you, I did. There was also horrific sexism, and sexual harassment was rife, and also bullying in those days, because there weren't that many women lawyers. working in the northeast of England. There's far, far more senior, I suppose, male, pale, stale, older white guys who were throwing their weight around, didn't really like women getting involved in what they saw. Well, I remember one of them said something about us fishing in their waters, for God's sake. You know, we were doing the same job as them. There was plenty of work to go around. We weren't spoiling it for them. But luckily for me, I had really good role models. I became part of a group of women who were older than me, actually, mostly from working class backgrounds. And they just kind of took me on and made me one of them, and we supported each other. 2 of them are sitting judges now, and we're all still very close today. They taught me how to handle the bullies. I remember one woman telling me that there was this really horrible, horrible guy. I'll just call him Paul. I won't say his full name. And one of the first times I'm in court, and he's quite a big guy, and I was leaning against a wall looking at my file, and he came and stood over me like that and spoke right into my face, very quietly, and said, "Now then, Miss McCurley, this is how we're going to do this case, because your client's going to back down." And at that moment, one of these older women came over and said, "Cris, can I have a quick word?" And I said, "Oh, excuse me," thinking, thank God. And she said, "He tries it on with every young woman lawyer. What you need to remember is when he does that to you, and he'll do it again, you say, 'Are you trying to intimidate me?'" So she walked away, came business as usual, and so I started yelling at me, "Are you trying to intimidate me?" And he was like, "Shh!" And he ran off, and he never ever did it again. So I always tell everybody now who's in my practice, if you meet that guy or somebody doing a similar thing to you, that's how you handle it. And you really have, I don't know if it's the same now, it certainly was for a very long time, you really had to earn your dues as a woman, particularly as a woman advocate in court. I remember the first time I went with one of these women as her trainee to the criminal court, and she was sitting along the magistrate's bench, and it was a long, long line of, it was all men and then us. And this old guy sitting next to her passed her a photograph of a man naked from the waist down, and he was like all tattooed in the genital area. And I think he just thought she'd like scream or something, and she just kind of looked at it and passed it on. And he was called, oh, I will say his name, he's long retired now, Peter MacDonald. So she passed it on to the next guy who was sitting next to her, and this guy looked at it and said, "What's this?" And she said, "It's Peter MacDonald, he's had a tattoo done." And he's going, "What? No, give it back!" So things like that, learning these little techniques that help you get through a tough working environment, which is so vital. I wouldn't have got through it otherwise. The next day I was in court with her again, and one of the ushers came over and said, "Have you heard about Peter MacDonald and his tattoo?" And Gwen, because it was Gwen, said, "I've seen a picture of it." He's never lived that down. But it's useful to kind of have these little tactics up your sleeve. I remember one of the partners in the first firm I worked at role-playing with me how to give some old sexual harassing bloke the brush off when he kept trying to collar me in corridors in court. Happy days, eh? So once I'd qualified, I started with the same group of women who I'd mentioned that I met during the research into effective received domestic abuse injunctions. The same group of black women who they were now part and parcel of what it's a massive BME women's refuge and help centre and counselling, and really a big holistic organisation in the northeast of England. And they're a sister organisation with Southall Black Sisters, who I also work with. And I referred my first case to Southall Black Sisters when I'd only just qualified, and I'd gone to see this woman who was in prison in Durham for murdering she killed a man who'd prostituted her, in fact, an Asian woman, an Indian woman. Zura Shah's her name. Amazing woman, actually. And I knew I was hopeless, and I knew that I didn't know anything, and what did I know? And spoke to the women at the Angelus Centre. They said, get in touch with the woman with the white hair in the front with her arm up. That's Pragna Patel. She's a qualified lawyer, but she works at Southall Black Sisters. And she's using her law degree and her experience to take strategic litigation to support BME women who really, really need the law changed for them. The woman that she's standing next to is Karanja Alualua, who was one of their first campaigns, I think, and you can see the difference in their ages. And this was around about the same time as Zura Shah. Karanjit had also been convicted of murdering her husband, and it was overturned on a duress defence. But Southall Black Sisters intervened in that case and managed to get her out of prison. I mean, it was just phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. It was kind of blowing all our minds, really. They took on Zura Shah's case as well, and they got her sentence drastically reduced. And I mean, they just do phenomenal work. And then into my working life came the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW. Are you familiar with CEDAW, people? Some nodding, some just no. Well, it's one of the human rights. It's one of the UN conventions. And if you think about the Convention for Human Rights, the UN Convention for Human Rights, and all of the articles about right to life, right to freedom from degrading and inhumane treatment, and so on. Well, there are several other conventions, and CEDAW is one of them, which drills down into each of those articles and protections and actually makes them a bespoke package for particular groups. And in 2011, God, I really fell on my feet. Somebody said, "Do you want to apply for this thing?" And it was a week-long workshop working with some of the women sitting in the front of some of the foremost international women lawyers. The woman in the yellow shalwar, she's I can't remember her name now, but she was actually a CEDAW commissioner from India. And what they did was, it was really hard work, but they took us through CEDAW and how it protects women and how we should all be using it in domestic litigation. So there's women from all over the world. The one and only time I was ever called Miss UK, because we couldn't remember each other's names, so I became Miss UK. Just before I went, the first ever case that was reported in the UK on using CEDAW was the case of Yemshaw versus Hounslow Borough Council, and it was Baroness Hale, Lady Hale, who heard the case. And it wasn't even a case that was about domestic abuse, but it was just before, well, it was just round about the time when all the massive cuts to legal aid were being, all the consultations had gone on. We could see the way that this was moving. And we knew it was going to impact women far, far more than men, because women use legal aid far, far more than men, because our economic power is not as great as theirs. And before any of it really kicked off, Baroness Hale heard this case. It wasn't even a domestic abuse case, it was a housing case. But she managed to bring into it CEDAW and a definition of domestic abuse. And that set the stall for how the government then had to define domestic abuse in terms of the legal aid changes. Massively important thing. So then we get the legal aid cuts, and savage, absolutely brutal, impacting women far, far more. Even the Minister of Justice's own equality impact assessment said, "Oh yeah, women will be affected more than men," but so what? It was an amazing time. We all went on strike. It was the most concerted activism that I've ever seen from the legal profession in my working life. And it's still going on, by the way, it's still going on. And then just as the cuts really bit, the United Kingdom were called to the UN to have an inquiry into how well the government of the UK was complying with the articles of the CEDAW Convention. It's like any convention. Every 4 or 5 or 6 years, each member state who signs up to it has to go and then explain themselves to the UN committee. And this is a group of people who went from England. Most of us from the northeast, actually, because we were so annoyed about what was happening. What happens is first of all, the government brings out a report saying, we're completely compliant with CEDAW, we're compliant with everything, and this is exactly how we're complying. And then a group of women's activists get together and write what's called the shadow report. And I was asked if I'd write the legal chapters for it. So, and we just absolutely trashed what they were saying about why they were compliant, because they weren't compliant. And I went along to the UN and I gave evidence against the government. we got a determination, a judgment more or less, from the UN to say that the UK was not compliant in terms of protections, legal protections for victims of domestic abuse, and that they had 2 years. That sounds like an awful long time, but I can tell you now from experience, that's like a flash in the pan in terms of getting legislative change to happen. They were given 2 years, which is a real embarrassment to the government, to sort this out and to make sure that every victim of domestic abuse who couldn't afford legal representation got legal aid. Massively exciting thing. Well, they didn't do anything at all. So Rights of Women took a judicial review to get them to change the legal aid regulations for victims of abuse. And this is loads of us protesting outside the High Court when the review was on. I gave evidence to the hearings, and we went from, first of all, we got permission from the single judge in the High Court, and then we were in the High Court itself, and the government won, and we lost, and we're all devastated. And then it went to the Court of Appeal, and we won. And we were very happy. So this is our little team. That's Emma Scott standing next to me on, how does that work? My right. And she was the director of Rights of Women at the time. The woman on the other side of me is Sarah Smith from the Public Law Project. And that's Zoe Leventhal, who was pro bono counsel for Rights of Women when we took that case. And we were really happy. The government were going to appeal to the Supreme Court, and it was a bit knife-edgy and we were all a bit scared. And then when we found out they weren't, well, we had a few drinks and we were very happy. And at that point, we were all invited onto the Ministry of Justice Working Group on changing the legal aid regulations to better fit the reality of lives of women who are experiencing domestic abuse. I have to say that the progress of that has been glacial. I mean, not least of all because of everything else that's been happening that's getting away of legislative time, like Brexit, election, prorogation, election, you name it. And I think in the time we've been in this working group, we've managed to get some really quite significant changes through to better the access to legal aid, and I won't bore you with the details, but we've made some shifts forward which have been quite significant. But we're still working on it, and that was 2016. So we're now into our fourth year of working with them on these changes. And then we've got a justice system that's in crisis, basically. Then in 2019 we went back to CEDAW. That's Harriet Wistrich on my left, and we gave evidence against the government again about the crisis in the family justice system. Harriet spoke about the crisis in the criminal justice system and how women are being really, really disadvantaged. And we got a further judgment against the government saying you must do better. And we were very happy again, as you can see. The domestic abuse bill is now before the Parliament. So there's one of my other legal heroes, Baroness Hale. This is her giving her judgment in the prorogation case, one of my finest memories. And I read somewhere that she said if she had to give her desert island judgments, then this would be the one that she chose to save if all the rest of them got washed away. Because she said it was her finest hour in court, and I have to say I think it probably was. One of the things that we talked about at CEDAW was about how the domestic abuse bill that's currently before Parliament, that came in something like 2013, and it's been relayed and relayed and relayed. It went back before Parliament again last week. I think it was Monday last week. My evidence to the Commission, the CEDAW commissioners, was that the bill was not fit for purpose. That it was window dressing, that it was didn't bear any relation to the reality of the lives of women and children who were experiencing abuse, and that without a massive, massive cash injection from the government into this critically failing civil and criminal justice system, the whole thing would just implode, and we wouldn't have one, essentially. And I was delighted to say the CEDAW commissioners agreed with me, and in their report they said, and it was quite interesting, the woman who is the CEDAW Special Commissioner for the UK said to the government, what you're proposing will not touch the sides in terms of what the need is without a massive, massive investment in this failing system. And it's a very, very powerful thing to hear that said about your own government, you know, on the international stage. So anyway, back to my heroes, Baroness Hale. I think we're lucky as a generation of women. I know we're several different generations in reality, but we've had some really terrific, positive role models. Baroness Hale being one of them. And she gave a lecture at Newcastle University Law School for the Inspirational Women of the Year event. And she described herself as a feminist, and a powerful feminist is what she said. And to have somebody in that position, President of the Supreme Court, to actually use the F word was just, it was so refreshing and so unusual. Does anyone know who that is? That's American Supreme Court Justice. Like Baroness Hale's counterpart, she's called the notorious RBJ, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Just incredible, incredible, powerful woman justice. And the woman in the middle, in fact, the woman on the far left is actually one of the women who have now joined, well, Baroness Hale's retired now, but that's Lady Justice Black, Jill Black, and she is on the Supreme Court with one other woman on the Supreme Court. A great story about Ruth Bader Ginsburg that somebody told at the weekend was they said to her, how many women do you think should be on the Supreme Court in the UK? And she said 9. There are only 9 of them on it. And again, it's just amazing to have women of that kind of level and that power to be able to make these punchy suggestions. And I should say I totally photobombed that picture. And the reason I did was because the woman in the Shalwar Kameez is Ashma Jahangir. She died last year, but she was one of my absolute legal heroes. She and her sister, Hina Jalani, started the first ever women's law firm in Pakistan, in Lahore. The first ever. And it is still going. And they've had death threats. They've had a woman was stabbed to death in their office once by the respondent in the case. And what they have done and what they have withstood, none of us will ever know of, thank God. But she was just an absolutely fantastic, powerful force for good in the world and for women and internationally in women's law. So yeah, these two were chatting away to each other, and I just said, "Excuse me, ladies." A friend of mine was standing in front with the camera. I just stood. I love that picture. Another legal hero is Harriet Wistrich, and that's Harriet in the grey suit with her arm up, and the woman next to her is Sally Challen. Harriet founded the Centre for Women's Justice a few years ago, and she has never stopped rocking the legal world since. I mean, I think the whole establishment's just terrified of her. Some of the cases that she's brought to the Supreme Court, Sally Challen was actually the Court of Appeal, and Sally Challen had been convicted of murdering her husband years and years ago. Actually, she'd pretty much served most of her sentence. She served at least 17 years of her sentence, and when she got in touch with, or it was actually her son, David, who got in touch with Centre for Women's Justice and said, "This isn't right. My mother was abused and mistreated, and the way that she was described in court made her sound like some jealous harpy going through her husband's phone. The reality is that he belittled her, he humiliated her, he made her life absolute hell until she was nothing. She thought she was nothing. And then she finally snapped." And coercive control wasn't a criminal offence when Sally Challen was convicted, but it is now. So what Harriet did was took everything back to, well, we need some proper medical evidence, we need some proper assessment of this, because she should never have been convicted of murder, ever. The sentence for manslaughter, she'd already served it. So when the court found in favour of Harriet's fantastic legal team and in favour of Sally Channon. She got a walk out of court. The CPS were talking about appealing it, but thankfully they didn't. And it really just shows what, if you've got the guts and you've got the drive, can be achieved by us as women lawyers. The small picture here, that's a group of women, one of them being Fiona Broadfoot. Maria and I were just talking about her before. Fiona was one of a group of women who, through Harriet, challenged their criminal records for soliciting prostitution. The reality is that these women were effectively sexually exploited as children, as young people, and inevitably picked up criminal records because there was no understanding at that time of child sexual exploitation. It was just very much a case of, well, it's a lifestyle choice, these are young prostitutes. And they won their case, actually, to get their records expunged so that they no longer have to declare when they're applying for jobs that they have soliciting prostitution convictions. I still think that is going to be appealed by the Ministry of Justice, which I think would be an absolute crime if it did. There's been some fantastic movements for change. The Me Too movement was and is so exciting. And the Weinstein verdict, which I didn't see coming. I thought we'd be seeing the horrible toad standing on the steps of the court, crowing that he'd got a great victory. So it was just so brilliant when he was convicted. Now, it does feel like the tide's turning slightly for us. I love that. It doesn't matter if I'm naked with a bourbon in each hand, no still means no. We're still fighting that now in the family courts and in the criminal courts here. There was a case that was heard on appeal by Ms Justice Russell, case of F v H, and I can give you the citation. I really recommend you read the appeal judgment, actually. And the judge at first instance was a designated family judge at Central London Court. And his judgment was that this woman had not been raped because although she was crying and saying no, she didn't do anything to fight him off. I mean, he got absolutely ripped apart in the higher court, and rightly so. But there are still an awful lot of judges out there who carry these same rape myth ideas. And then finally, I love this slide. I use it in loads of presentations, actually. The truth is we are still having to protest the same fucking shit over and over and over again, and we'll continue to have to do so as long as we have people in power who are undermining human and women's rights. There's an inquiry on at the moment about the failure of the family courts to deal appropriately with domestic abuse. That's had an interim report out, but we're expecting probably won't be their final report, actually, because I think that the panel have realised once they've started to take evidence that they were opening a massive, massive can of worms, and there is so much wrong with the way we deal with domestic abuse in family courts generally, in public and private law. And we do not have a trauma-based approach, which we need to have if victims of abuse are going to get their rights properly addressed. Legal aid cuts have gone too far, we're still fighting them. But I think I said at the beginning, women are bearing the brunt of all the changes that are going on at the moment, and I'm quite close to retirement age. I know, don't look it, but I am quite close to retirement age. And I'm starting to think about now, who's going to take my place? And Harriet's older than me. I mean, when we go, we're leaving a gap for you guys to step into, hopefully. So we're passing on the baton. And the reason for all this long rambling chat is about, if I can do it, you can do it. And I really hope that you will get involved and take up the baton and carry on the fight, because I think I can't see things getting any better any time soon. So we're going to need you. So anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you
Oh, you're welcome.
I'm going to come and turn the recording off, but I'm just
Yeah,
so delighted that passing on the baton through this recording, because it will reach so far and wide. So just like, sorry.
Can I just get out of the way?
Yeah, that'll be, yeah, thank you.